In this lesson, we'll take a 200-year journey throughout the history of economic thought and do it all in just a couple minutes. Are you ready? In most courses involving the concepts of corporate social responsibility, one is likely to encounter a 1970 New York Times Magazine article written by Milton Friedman titled, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Milton Friedman was a Nobel Prize winner in economics and advisor to business leaders and heads of states throughout the world. To say Friedman's influence upon business school teaching and practice is immense would be a gross understatement. Upon his death in 2006, The Economist proclaimed Milton Friedman was, quote, the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century, possibly of it all, end quote. This book, Capitalism and Freedom, is arguably his most influential offering and is the text from which his New York Times Magazine piece, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits," was largely drawn. When Friedman proclaimed that the single responsibility of business, otherwise said the purpose of business, is to increase its profits, it had a big effect. Friedman was effectively stating that companies must focus on pursuing their own self-interest. I'll talk about Friedman's effect on modern-day business in a moment when we discuss Michael Porter. But before that, let's consider how exactly did Milton Friedman justify his view that the sole responsibility of business is to increase its profits? Well, he pointed to an influential figure from 2 centuries earlier, Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a Scottish-born moral philosopher and pioneer of political economy. He's often cited as the father of modern economics and is best known for his 2 classic works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments from 1759 and The Wealth of Nations from 1776. While The Theory of Moral Sentiments is rarely, if ever, quoted by economists like Friedman, The Wealth of Nations is often invoked, and I have it right here in my hand. I rarely go anywhere without it. Friedman wrote a summary piece about economics and economic policy in 1986 that is most useful. This is a somewhat lengthy quote, but is so critically important as it summarizes Friedman's justifications, so please bear with me. Friedman wrote, quote, "The founder of our discipline, as we view it today, was Adam Smith. His book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, is both the first scientific treatise in economics and one of the most effective tracts intended to influence public policy that's ever been published." Friedman continued, "We do not regard a businessman as selflessly devoted to the public interest. We think of a businessman as in business to improve his own welfare, to serve his own interest. Adam Smith taught us that, quote, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest," end quote. Friedman selected this quote, which appears on page 119 of my copy of The Wealth of Nations, to justify his view that companies exist and should exist to pursue their own self-interest. This is profoundly important to consider. Milton Friedman's justification about the purpose of modern-day companies is based upon a quote cherry-picked out of a text from 2 centuries before about a butcher, brewer, and baker. You may detect a bit of cynicism in me here today, and you're correct. I'm a bit cynical that this lone quote is routinely picked out of one of Smith's many offerings to justify the claim that the purpose of business is solely to maximize profits. But let's set aside the fact that Smith was a moral philosopher and political economist who wrote a great deal more about ethics in society and the importance of community and personal responsibility than this lone quote would indicate. And let's set aside the fact that one could readily make the argument that this quote was unjustifiably drawn out of context as a deliberate means to justify a particular agenda being advocated by Friedman and the Chicago School of Neoclassical Economic Thought, championed at the University of Chicago, where Friedman was based. Let's just focus our attention on the degree to which Smith's butcher, brewer, and baker may be similar or dissimilar to the equivalent businesses of the modern-day context in which Friedman was writing. Given that Friedman was attempting to apply Smith's quote from some 200 years earlier to a modern context, this seems to be an important item to consider. And a major difference that comes to mind between Smith and Friedman's time is the rise of the modern-day corporation. Consider a butcher, brewer, or baker from Smith's time. These were small businesses comprised of an owner and maybe a couple of employees. The owner was both the owner and manager of the enterprise. Any employees they had were also likely members of the community and perhaps their neighbors or their sons and daughters. The butcher, brewer, and baker likely personally knew many of their customers and suppliers by name, as they were all members of the same community. Their children may have been taught at the same schools as their suppliers and their customers' children. In other words, Smith's butcher, brewer, and baker were deeply embedded within their communities, and their personal reputations were likely deeply tied to their respective businesses and how they were perceived within the community. Now, consider a butcher, brewer, or baker of modern day. The modern day butcher is a huge meat processing corporation like Tyson Foods or JBS. The modern day brewer is a huge brewery corporation like Anheuser-Busch InBev or SAB Miller. And the modern day baker is a huge bakery corporation like Grupo Bimbo or General Mills. Indeed, small businesses exist today, but let's focus our attention on large corporations, given they did not exist in Smith's time, so it is pertinent for us to question whether Smith's quote is applicable for large corporations of the modern day. The modern day butcher, brewer, and bakery corporations have a global reach and influence beyond anything Smith could have fathomed. The modern day corporation is not an embedded member of the community like Smith's baker, for example, but instead is often comprised of global networks of employees and global supply chains where ownership is comprised and dispersed and oftentimes anonymous shareholders. And the modern day corporation has power to influence governments and regulators to a degree that an individual butcher, brewer, or baker could not. So, even if we accept Friedman's assertion that Smith intended to convey the butcher, brewer, and baker should pursue their own self-interest without consideration of others, these individuals were deeply influenced by the interests of those around them, their communities. The butcher, brewer, and baker of Smith's time was deeply embedded within their communities, whereby it would be in these individuals' self-interest to take into account the well-being of others around them, as their businesses and personal reputations would suffer if they didn't. The modern corporation is a dramatically different entity that lacks this degree of embeddedness within the community. Okay, for the time being, we'll put aside the critique involving Friedman's invocation of Smith for justification of self-interest pursuit, but we'll return to this. Let's turn our attention to the application in business of Milton Friedman's proclamation that companies should focus on self-interest maximization, that is to say, increase profits. Here we turn to another economist who is the world's most well-known strategic management thinker, Michael Porter. Porter is the individual who effectively operationalized Milton Friedman in business through the concept of achieving a competitive advantage and his famous Porter's 5 forces model that is second nature to the world's MBA students. Porter drew from Friedman's teachings that companies should focus solely on their own self-interest, that is to say, maximize profits. Porter's 5 forces model is arguably the most well-known and widely used strategic management tool and exemplifies the view that companies should consider solely their own self-interest. The 5 forces model tees up a view of business in which a company is in competition with its industry peers, or more commonly stated, its competitors. That's one of the 5 forces. The company is also teed up in competition with the threat of new entrants in the industry and the threat of substitute products or services. Those are 2 of the other 5 forces. Finally, the 5 forces model tees up a view where the company is actually in competition with its suppliers and its customers, because suppliers want to charge more and the company wants to pay less for its raw materials, and because customers want to pay less and the company wants to charge more for its goods and services. In this view of the world propagated by Porter's 5 forces model, the company is at the center of a competitive-fueled battle where everyone is squarely focused on their own self-interest and is out to get theirs. The 5 forces model is a direct application of Friedman's assertion that companies exist to solely maximize their profits. Now, more recently, Michael Porter has made a significant turn that could perhaps be seen as heresy to the traditions of Milton Friedman, as Porter is now stating that perhaps the purpose of business needs to be redefined. In his 2011 Harvard Business Review article with co-author Mark Kramer titled "Creating Shared Value," Porter states, quote, "The purpose of the corporation must be redefined as creating shared value, not just profit per se." We will consider the concept of shared value as part of this course and how it is conspicuously Scandinavian. So more on that to come. But for the moment, keep in mind that the debate is live and well regarding the purpose of business, with the likes of Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, and Michael Porter very much at the center of it all. We'll now turn to the concepts of sustainability and CSR as a means to further explore this.